This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain or website or an online store, make it with Squarespace. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. You can find a link in the description below. He achieved legendary status amongst conmen by pulling off some of the most outrageous, brazen, and unbelievable deceits in the history of fraud. By the age of 21, he had impersonated a Pan Am pilot, a pediatric supervising doctor, and a lawyer, charming everyone he met and bouncing checks all over the world. In this week's Biographics, we take a look at the incredible story of Frank William Abagnale. Frank William Abagnale was born on April 27, 1948 in New Rochelle, New York. Named after his father, who owned a stationery business, Frank was the third of 4 children. His mother, Paulette, was of French-Algerian extraction. The couple met while Frank Sr. was on active service in Algiers during World War II. They were soon married, despite a 13-year age gap. Frank Sr. proved to be a very successful businessman, with the stationery store doing exceptionally well. As a result, the family lived in a large home, and although the Abagnales were by no means rich, Frank Jr. and his siblings had a comfortable childhood. Frank attended Iona Catholic School in Westchester, New York, and his world was turned upside down in 1960 when his parents separated. This came as a shock to all the children, who thought that their mother was a contented housewife who had everything she ever wanted. However, Frank Sr. was active in local politics, he was active in the management of the New York Yacht Club, and he also was a very keen deep-sea fisherman. All of these interests meant that he was often away from home. One day he came home from an overseas marlin fishing adventure to find that his wife and kids had simply moved out. Frank Sr., he was crushed by the separation. He deeply loved his wife and fought to get her back until the day that he died. But Paulette's mind, it was made up. As a sign of independence, she enrolled in dental college and began building a life of her own. Frank Sr., he recruited Jr. to help him win back Paulette's affections. He would give his son gifts to pass on, schooling him on what to say and how to say it. But Paulette, she wouldn't budge. The couple divorced when Frank was only 14. Unlike his siblings, Frank chose to live with his father. This opened up a whole new world for the teenager who had been used to a regimented and disciplined life with his mother. Tagging along with his dad, he began spending time in the bars around New York as Frank Sr. wheeled and dealed amongst the city's businessmen and politicians. The experience, it quickly made the boy very streetwise. It was around this time that Frank began to skip school in order to run with a handful of local punks who were, like him, from dysfunctional families, and they were looking for some way to express their frustrations. Frank was bigger and more mature looking than his associates, which was handy when it came to playing hooky. He was often mistaken for a teacher on an outing with his students. The group committed minor crimes like sneaking into movie theaters and stealing candy. Frank soon became frustrated with the childishness and lack of sophistication of his partners in crime, though. They did not exhibit any of the class that he realized was key to making it as a successful criminal. Things came to a head when his friends stole a car while the owner was watering his lawn. They swung by to pick up Frank, only to be stopped by the police moments later. Frank and his fellow cons were thrown into juvenile detention. Frank Sr.'s political connections, though, they managed to get his son sprung and to have any mention of the incident erased from the record. Frank's dad told him that he was wasting his time hanging around with kids who were clearly not as mature or as sophisticated as he was. It was time to start acting like a man, his father said. This pep talk, it seemed to do the trick, and Frank began attending school regularly. He also got a part-time job as a shipping clerk at a warehouse in Bronxville. To show his support for his son's change of direction, Frank Sr. bought him his first car, an old Ford. Having a set of wheels opened up new horizons for Frank. Specifically, it allowed him to meet and enjoy the company of women. For the next couple of years, by his own admission, he was consumed with satisfying his teenage libido. He would cruise around town looking for a young lady that he could entice with his ever-growing charm into an evening of intimate activity. Frank soon discovered that his sexual excursions, they cost money. Invariably, he'd have to supply his conquest with a coconut burger in order to keep her happy. The problem was that his meager finances did not not allow for such an expense. Frank approached his dad and requested a gas charge card. He promised that he wouldn't abuse this privilege, and his father was impressed with his sincerity. He handed over his mobile card soon after. A month later, Frank enacted his first scam. Pulling into a mobile gas station, he saw a sign announcing that you can put a new set of tires on your car and charge it to your mobile card. It was then that he realized that you could use the card for other things aside from gas. Thinking fast, he approached an attendant at the station that he was familiar with. Frank asked what it would cost for a new set of tires, and the answer was $160. Frank readily acknowledged that he didn't need new tires, but said that he was desperately short of cash. So he suggested that he buy the set of tires and charge them to the card, but rather than taking the tires, the attendant would give Frank $100 for them. He could then sell off the tires for $160, making a quick $60 profit. 10 minutes later, Frank drove away from the mobile station with $100 cash in his pocket. And it was that which hooked him. Over the next few weeks, Frank replicated the scheme at different mobile stations around the Bronx. At times, he would simplify the deal, offering the pump attendant to give him $10 of cash while signing a bill for $20 of gas. It was only when the bill from Mobil arrived that Frank realized that his father was the chump who would pay for his excesses. But Frank, he had a simple solution. He threw the bills into the waste bin. Of course, though that wasn't a solution at all, it didn't solve anything. Pretty soon, a Mobil representative visited Frank Sr. at his store and requested an explanation for an outstanding $3,400 bill in 3 months after 15 years of impeccable payment history. Frank Jr. was called in front of both men to explain. He said he didn't know what they were talking about, but neither man was convinced. Finally, Frank admitted it, offering this excuse. "It's the girls, Dad. They do funny things to me. I can't explain it." His father nodded with a wry smile and replied, "Don't worry about it, boy. Einstein couldn't understand it either." Unfortunately for young Frank, his mother wasn't so understanding. She blamed his criminal activity on the influence of his father and promptly organized for him to attend a Catholic private school for problem children. Frank spent a year there, and during those 12 months, his father's financial fortunes took a steep reverse, and he lost almost everything. He was quick to assure his son that the $3,400 that he had stolen was not a factor in his money problems. Frank left home at 16. He left without saying a word to anyone, hopping on a train to New York City. Along with the few belongings that he had crammed into a suitcase, he had in his possession a checkbook that had $200 in the account. An hour off the train, he had attached himself to a teenage boy and convinced him to take him home with him. Frank went on to spin a story about being an orphan and that he was determined to make it on his own in the big city. The parents said that he could stay for as long as he wanted. The next day, Frank got a job as a stock clerk for $1.50 per hour. He quickly found out that this was not going to pay his way in New York. He figured that the reason for his low wage was his age, so he simply altered the date on his driver's license from 1948 to 1938. Now, as a 26-year-old, he went out looking for another job, and he found one as a truck driver's helper for $2.75 an hour. Frank supplemented his income by cashing checks from his account. After a few days, he knew that his account was overdrawn, but that technicality did not faze him. He continued writing bad checks on a daily basis. It didn't take him long to rationalize that his time working for $2.75 an hour was simply not worth the effort. Therefore, he quit and simply wrote more bad checks. One day, while walking along 42nd Street, Frank was stopped in his tracks at the sight of an aircrew from Eastern Airlines emerging from the Commodore Hotel. He was mesmerized as the captain, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 4 stewardesses breezed by. Frank wrote in his memoir that he had never seen such a splendid group of people. His mind began to work overtime. Imagine if he was a pilot. He would have instant respect, and as a result, he would be able to cash checks anywhere with impunity. Continuing down the street, he found himself outside of the Pan Am building. Quickly, he formulated a plan. He returned to his accommodation, found Pan Am's phone number, rang, and asked to speak to someone in the purchasing department. He went on to inform the purchasing officer that he was a Pan Am pilot based in Los Angeles. He was due to hop a flight back home at 8 p.m., but his uniform had been stolen. He confidently requested a replacement uniform. The helpful purchasing officer gave Frank directions to the uniform company to pick up his uniform. He walked out with a complete co-pilot's uniform in hand. What he needed now was a pilot's ID card. He quickly had one made up, affixing the Pan Am logo from a model plane that he had purchased for $2.49. Decked out in his pilot uniform, Frank walked in to LaGuardia Airport. He was soon approached by a TWA pilot who asked what Pan Am was doing at LaGuardia. It turns out that Pan Am did not fly out of LaGuardia. Picking up on his research, Frank replied, "Oh, I just deadheaded in from Frisco on the first flight I could catch. I'll catch a chopper to Kennedy." The answer seemed to satisfy, but then the co-pilot asked, "What kind of equipment are you on?" This threw Frank. In his research, he hadn't come across the word equipment used in any context. Searching for the right answer, he came out with General Electric. The pilot was actually asking what type of plane Frank flew, so the quizzical look on his face at this reply was rather understandable. Frank quickly made his departure. He didn't attempt to board a plane that first day. He was to spend some weeks getting confident in his role as he wandered the airport, struck up conversations with pilots, and built his store of shop knowledge. During this time, he also found great success in cashing checks in his pilot's uniform. In fact, the tellers, they couldn't give him cash fast enough. Finally, ready to take to the skies, Frank turned up at LaGuardia's Eastern Operations Office and informed the desk clerk that he needed to deadhead to Miami on the next flight, assuming that there was room on the plane. Deadheading was the name used for the practice of allowing staff to travel for free in order to get to a job location. He was told there was a vacancy on a flight departing in 15 minutes. Just a few moments later, he found himself in the cockpit in a tiny seat that came down from the door behind him. With him were the pilot, co-pilot, and flight attendant. After asking what type of equipment he flew, the three pretty much ignored him for the rest of the flight. Before getting off at Miami, Frank made a date with one of the stewardesses who was laying over in Miami that night. Amazed at how simple the whole process had been, Frank became a serial deadheader. Upon arriving in a city, he would stay overnight in a motel used by Pan Am staff. He'd charge the bill to the company, and in the morning, before heading to his next deadhead flight, cash a bad check for $100 or more just to have some ready cash. This pattern continued for the next 2 years, between the ages of 16 and 18, taking him to 26 countries on more than 250 flights that covered in excess of 1 million miles. By the middle of 1966, Frank was ready for a new gig. He had experienced a close call when someone had stated that he didn't actually work for Pan Am. Fortunately, his bluster and feigned outrage got him through the challenge, but he knew that eventually the game was going to be up. It was when applying for a long-term lease on an apartment in Atlanta, Georgia, that he, on a whim, wrote down his profession as medical doctor. When asked what type of doctor he was, he replied that he was a pediatrician based in California, but was on a 12-month sabbatical to audit some research papers. Things went well for a period of time, until one day he got a knock at the door. His new neighbor introduced himself, Willis Granger, Dr. Willis Granger, chief resident pediatrician at the Smithers General Hospital in Marietta. Frank was afraid that Granger would blow his cover, but fortunately the real doctor wasn't one to talk shop, and they were able to cross each other's paths without incident. Meanwhile, Frank spent as much time as he could at the local library reading up on the subject of pediatrics. A few weeks later, Frank felt confident enough to accept an offer from Dr. Granger to tour Smithers General Hospital. After that, he made regular visits. On one such occasion, he was approached by the hospital administrator and asked to do a huge favor. Could he cover a midnight to 8 shift for a doctor who would be away for 10 days due to a death in the family? Frank objected that he didn't have a license to practice in Georgia, but the administrator countered that he really wouldn't be doing anything during the night shift, just overseeing the interns and nurses. So long as he passed an interview panel of 5 doctors, everything would be just fine. Frank's initial impulse was to refuse. There were too many dangers involved here. But he was intrigued with the challenge, and so he agreed. Much to Frank's relief, the interview was light-hearted and non-inquisitorial. He was now a night-shift pediatric supervising doctor with 8 interns and 40 nurses under his control. In order to make it through, Frank took on the persona of a rule-breaking anti-establishment practitioner in the mold of Hawkeye Pierce on his favorite TV show MASH. Things went smoothly until he was called to the emergency room. He took his time getting there, hoping that an intern would step in. When he finally arrived, there were 3 interns gathered around the patient. Frank asked them for their diagnoses, and when all 3 agreed, he told them to go ahead with the procedure. At the end of his 10-day stint, Frank was approached by the administrator and informed that the doctor he was replacing was not coming back. He was asked if he could stay on until a replacement could be found. He ended up spending 11 months as a doctor at Smithers Hospital. After finishing up at the hospital, Frank decided to leave Atlanta. He moved to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he met up with a flight steward that he had formerly had a relationship with. Remembering that Frank had told her about his supposed law degree from Harvard, the girl introduced him at a party to Assistant State's Attorney Jason Wilcox. On learning that Frank was currently out of work, Wilcox told him that the Attorney General was looking for bright, articulate young lawyers. He suggested that Frank take the bar exam and go to practice with them. Once again, Frank found it impossible to resist the challenge. On his third attempt, he passed the bar exam. He was given a position in one of the Attorney General's civil departments. The job was really that of a glorified errand boy, but Frank was happy in the anonymity of the role. Around this time, he began dating a girl named Gloria, who was a staunch Methodist. Through his relationship, he ended up on a church committee, sitting alongside a man who was a real graduate of Harvard Law School. This guy began asking too many specific questions, and Frank knew that it was time to pull the plug on his legal career. Frank next turned up in Utah, where he claims to have scammed his way into becoming a teacher at Brigham Young University for 8 months. However, the university denies that he ever works there. By now, Frank was wanted in many parts of the world for a long list of fraudulent activities. The FBI were on his trail, as was Interpol. His luck finally ran out while he was spending time in the southern French town of Montrachet. He was arrested on the basis of an Interpol warrant for fraud issued from Sweden for fraudulent checks written during a visit while he was supposedly a Pan Am employee. The French authorities, they soon discovered that he had written false checks all over their country, and they refused to honor the extradition. Frank was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment in France, which, after being reduced to 6 months, was served at Perpignan prison. Conditions were abysmal, and Frank's weight went from 198 to 109 pounds during his stay there. He was then extradited to Sweden, where he served another 6 months. Upon his release from Malmö prison in Sweden, Frank was taken into custody by US federal officials and returned to the United States. After a third trial, he was convicted to 12 years imprisonment for multiple cases of fraud. During his time in US custody, he escaped twice, but was recaptured on both occasions. After 4 years in jail, Frank was offered a deal. His prison term would be quashed if he agreed to be an on-call consultant to assist the authorities to investigate fraud cases. Frank, he agreed. After his release from prison, he took on a succession of menial jobs only to be fired for not revealing his criminal past. He then decided to parlay his vast criminal experience into a legitimate career by becoming a security consultant and advising companies on how they could avoid the sorts of scams that he had perpetuated for so long. He went on to set up his own fraud protection company, Abagnale Associates. He has been advising the FBI on fraud-related matters for more than 40 years. Frank Abagnale, aged 70 in 2018, lives in Charleston, South Carolina with his wife Kelly. They have 3 sons, one of whom works for the FBI. Now, in today's video, you learned all about the identities that Frank Abagnale took on over the years, but you know what establishes a strong and legitimate identity these days? A beautiful personal website, and you can do that with Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to create a powerful online identity. Maybe you're like me and you need a place on the web for people to find you, or maybe you're starting a new business and you need to set up an online presence or a store. Well, you can do it all with Squarespace. On Squarespace, it all starts with a stunning template, and with names like Pursuit and Royce, you know they've got to be cool. Seriously, they are actually very good looking and cool, so do check them out. Or if you hate beautiful templates, not judging here, you can start from scratch. Squarespace make it super easy to make something that looks amazing. You can also easily move over an existing domain, and if you've hosted a website anywhere else, you know that's a good idea because it generally sucks. It's a lot easier. In fact, it's great if you go with Squarespace. And once you've gone through the super easy customization process, there are no updates, no patches, no tech BS to deal with. No one likes tech BS. But you know what everyone does like? That would be Squarespace's 24/7 customer support. They're there to help you whenever you've got a question. And Squarespace is not just about an online presence. As I said, if you're starting a business and want to sell online, Squarespace great place to do it. Look, if you're looking to pursue a dream or anything like that, you need a website, and you can do that with Squarespace. There's no better way. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Do subscribe to this channel for more biographies every Monday and every Thursday. Also, hit that like button if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.